What if I told you that some of Jamaica's most important healers, people who provided medicine, spiritual support, and guidance, were once hunted by colonial rulers? In the early 1900s, deep in the hills of Manchester, stood Blakespen Balmyard. It was more than a healing center. It was a sanctuary of African wisdom, a refuge for the community, and a quiet act of resistance in a world determined to criminalize African spirituality. Welcome to Jamaican Voodoo, where we uncover stories of African resistance and cultural survival in Jamaica. If you love exploring hidden histories and want to learn more about powerful Jamaican traditions, hit that subscribe button. Now let's dive in. In Jamaica, a barmyard is a sacred healing space where herbal medicine, spiritual baths, and divination work together to restore balance and well-being. It is a place you go when seeking the wisdom of the Obeah woman or Obeah man. These are spiritual healers who assess medical conditions, offer insights, and prepare herbal remedies rooted in centuries of African knowledge. Among the most renowned of these sanctuaries was Blakespen Balmyard in Manchester. Established in the 1870s by Rose Anne Forbes, by the early 1900s, Blakespen had grown into a spiritual institution, a pillar of the community and a vital element of Jamaica's holistic healing heritage. But as its influence grew, so did the watchful eyes of colonial authorities who were determined to suppress African-derived spiritual traditions. In 1910, the pressure finally reached Rose Anne Forbes. On August 3rd, she was charged under Jamaica's newly strengthened medical laws for practicing medicine without a license. She was found guilty and ordered to pay a substantial fine. The judge reprimanded her sternly, calling the matter very serious, and warning that if the police ever discovered bottles and feathers in her possession, she could be charged with the even more feared crime of practicing Obeah. He advised her to destroy her healing tools and dress differently to avoid further suspicion. In truth, the law was not merely regulating medicine. It was policing culture, suppressing identity, and attempting to erase African spirituality. Every fine, threat, and prosecution was a deliberate attempt to dictate not just what people could do, but who they could be, turning the simple act of healing into a battleground for cultural survival. But Blakespen Balmyard did not fade away. Instead, the healing work continued, with Rose Anne and her husband George Forbes running what newspapers described as a bombing sanatorium. By 1916, their reputation had grown far beyond Manchester. Hundreds traveled from distant parishes, people suffering from sores, chronic illness, and all manners of ailments, seeking the treatment that the Forbes family was known for. Patients were bathed in herbal mixtures, given herbal preparations, and housed on the property for as long as it took to recover. Many people prefer these traditional African remedies, trusting the ancestral knowledge that had brought healing to their communities for generations. That same year, the police launched a targeted operation. Authorities had been watching the barmyard for months, suspicious of its growing popularity and success. On July 3, 1916, Rose Anne and her husband George Forbes were arrested in Mandeville, charged with practicing Obeah, and placed in lockup. Reports described George as a respectable-looking man and the founder of the bombing business, yet it was Rose Anne Forbes who held the reins and was the true healer behind Blakespen Balmyard. The case moved forward, and on April 4, 1917, the trial of George Forbes began. A laborer from St. Elizabeth, Theophilus Dorman, served as the principal decoy witness sent to gather evidence against the couple, but testimony revealed the extent of the healer's work. People of all backgrounds sought them out, and many testified that the Forbes herbal baths and remedies were more effective than conventional European medicine. Sensing the weakness of an Obeah charge, the judge and attorneys agreed to abandon it and instead prosecute George under the medical law. The prosecutor Alexander made it clear that Rose Anne Forbes, not George, was the real target. He reminded the court that she was convicted years earlier for practicing medicine, insisting that this kind of thing was a disgrace. Alexander demanded a heavy fine to dismantle what he called a nest of improper things. The judge then delivered a stern lecture to George Forbes, but he did not stop there. Rose Anne was summoned before the bench and warned to discontinue her healing work entirely. The threat was unmistakable. If either of them ever returned to court on similar charges, they could face a €50 fine, an enormous sum at that time, along with imprisonment. The story of Rose Anne and George Forbes is more than a legal case. It's a window into Jamaica's long struggle for the freedom to practice African spirituality. Balmyards like Blake's Pen were not merely sanatoriums, they were spaces of resistance, care, and community survival. The colonial legal system could impose fines, threats, and surveillance, but it could never extinguish the resilience of Jamaica's African healing traditions or the legacy of those who kept them alive.